Are you tired of grabbing free pawns and then getting your queen trapped? In today's video, I'm going to discuss poisoned pawns, common patterns and ideas that emerge from these positions, how and when to grab the pawn and get away with it, or how to get massive compensation for your sacrificed pawn. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. First things first, let's start by discussing what poisoned pawns are. So poisoned pawns in chess refer to these pawns right here, either B or G pawns, and sometimes the queens go out and capture these pawns. For white, that would be moves like queen b3, queen b7. Sometimes the queens go out and capture these pawns, and there are certain situations when the queens get trapped, but there are some other situations where queens can successfully take those pawns and get away with them. So let me show you a live example of what I'm talking about. Let's take a fantasy variation of the Caro-Kann. Here, let's say queen to b6 is played and knight to c3, e6. And in this position right here, if white were to play this move, bishop to e3, in this case, black would capture this pawn on b2 and black would be able to get away with it because moves like rook b1 blunder the knight, and if you were to protect this knight before you go rook b1 as the white pieces, the queen has this getaway square on a3. This is a very, very common getaway square in these sorts of positions. Black is successfully able to get away with the pawn and black is slightly better. There is some compensation here for the white pieces because white has a lot more pieces developed than black. However, this knight is kind of loose because this knight has to protect it, and because this knight has to protect it, the bishop cannot be easily developed, so white's pieces are a little bit clunky in this position right here. So going back, instead of bishop to e3, the most played move and the best move in the position is this move pawn to a3. Now after pawn to a3, let's say black just continues developing, bishop to e7. What if bishop to e3 is played now? Well, in a situation like this, queen takes b2 actually loses the game right away. It is a losing blunder for only one move, though. There's only one move for the white pieces, and that is this move, knight to a4. Knight a4 traps this queen on b2. There are absolutely no more getaway squares. All of the squares over here are covered. a3 is covered. All of the squares here are covered either by the pawn, the bishop, or by the knight. So everything on this file, on the diagonals, absolutely everything is covered. The queen is trapped. So whenever your opponents play a3 in these sorts of positions, remember that a3 takes away the getaway square from a3 itself, and you have a harder time capturing this pawn because of this move, knight to a4. You no longer have a getaway on a3, and now your queen is trapped. Let me show you some other patterns, and I'm going to show you the opening as well. Let's say it is the Pirc defense and it is this variation right here. These are not necessarily the best moves. However, I just want to illustrate an idea. So I will get to this position right here. If this pawn on b2 is taken right here, and as you can see, this is another poisoned pawn situation. So what happens if black captures the pawn on b2? In this case, knight a4 doesn't quite work because, as I said earlier, the queen can get away. In this case, it can get away on a3. It can also get away over here. I believe d4 is the best square for it currently because it also attacks this pawn and the knight at the same time. So the black queen is able to get away in a situation like this. Therefore, this knight a4 move does not quite work. However, another way to go after the queen is to play rook to b1. Now, after rook to b1, this is actually the most common way to attack this queen. After rook b1, let's say queen goes to a3. However, the attack is not exactly over. In this position, there is this move, knight to b5. And here the queen is being attacked, c7 is being attacked with a fork, and the queen does not really have a lot of squares. If the queen goes to a6, this loses immediately and everything is attacked. If queen goes to a4, this also loses to knight d6 and bishop to b5 check. Once again, this loses the queen. And if you were to get ultra greedy and actually capture the pawn on a2, now you still get trapped with this move, bishop to c3. A very calm, cool, and collected move. And what do you do here? Rook a1 is coming and there's absolutely nothing you can do. Rook a1 will arrive it will trap your queen, and there is absolutely nothing you can play in this position to save the queen. If you go to a4, it's the same exact tactic. It's going to be either knight e6 or knight c7. It's going to be bishop e5. It's going to be stuff like that. So this would also trap the queen. This is not good for the black pieces. But let's say you defend knight c7 and then rook a1, you still lose the queen. So this is another way you can lose the queen in a position like that. Okay, let's take a look at another queen trap pattern, and it's gonna go something like this. I'm not gonna talk about every single opening move once again. The goal here is to discuss the poisoned pawn. So in a position like this, black plays knight to d7, giving up this pawn on b7. Let's say the pawn is accepted, but after rook to b8, the queen is in a bit of a trouble here, because if it goes to a6, then b2 is simply hanging, and black has a lot of compensation. Actually, black gets the pawn back right away with a lot of additional activity. b1 is hanging right here, because the rook and the bishop would both be attacking it, and this is not a great position. However, if the queen captures on a7, now the position gets a little bit tricky. Here there's this idea of playing knight to e4. Now knight e4 hits the bishop and also has a very devious threat. Right now the threat is to take this bishop on g5. Let's say the bishop goes back to c1, defending this pawn on b2. It makes sense, right? Very solid move. However, this doesn't work because it leads to a queen trap in a position like this. Rook to a8, and now the only legal move for the queen is to go to b7, to not be lost, I should say. The only square for the queen to go to and not be lost is b7. However, it's still going to be lost because knight to b6, this allows the queen to get away from this b file to go to b3 and let's say go back, and the knight b6 blocks off that way. But in this case, after a move like let's say f3, this knight will go back to d6, and then this bishop will go back to d7, and now the queen is once again trapped. The pawn is protected by the knight. c5 is the only square the queen can go to, but once again, this is a miserable position. You can keep going like this, but you will get trapped. I promise you that. You will get trapped. One way or another, black will trap you. You cannot make so many moves back and forth like this. Take pawn and take two pawns and expect to get away with it. So in this position, the queen is finally trapped. Nobody's getting away. This right here, ladies and gentlemen, is what happens when you take poisoned pawns without developing. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of other examples. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly though, because I don't want to take up too much time on these positions right here. All of them are in a single study, and the link to that study is in the description. So if you want to analyze any of the positions that you see in this video, go to the description, click the link to the study, and it will take you to the study that I made, and you can take a look at all of these positions on your own. So in a position like this is the London system. Let's say opponent takes the pawn on c5. We can grab this pawn on b2, and then we can get a position like this. The material is equal because white also took a pawn on c5. However, it is getting really active for the white pieces. White is getting all of his pieces out while black is out here grabbing pawns. The king hasn't castled, neither of the two bishops have developed, and this is a very difficult position to play. And if we just keep going, we need to continue developing here, but in this case there's this line where you grab another pawn and then the bishop goes back and you go into a variation like this with queen to g4 and then offering a queen trade. If you actually go queen to h4, there's a very funny line here which wins for the white pieces, and that is this move knight to f3. You cannot go to a4 because bishop b5 check. This pattern once again emerges. However, you can go to g4, and then after h3 you can grab this pawn on g2. This is funny because this queen has not only grabbed the b poisoned pawn, it also grabbed the g poisoned pawn in one single game. I've never seen something like this. I've never seen another line ever where that's the case. However, in this case it is a bit too much, and the queen is simply getting trapped with this move rook h2, and this position is winning for the white pieces. Let me show you some other examples. In this position right here, black plays this move a6. We can capture this pawn on b7, but it's not entirely great because of this move knight to a5. We talked about this pattern earlier with knight a4. It's the same pattern, but with the colors reversed. Black plays knight to a5. We need to go back to b4, only square that we can go to, because this knight is on e7. It is blocking the bishop, and in this position there's only one move for the black pieces to be better, and it is this move bishop to c2. Because if you play the regular move, let's just say knight to c6, there's queen a4 and the queen is getting away, or the queen will simply just hang out on this a4 square. It doesn't even have to go back necessarily. However, if bishop to c2 is played, now there's a threat of a queen trap, and this is very, very dangerous. And after a couple of moves, let's say bishop to g5, we get into a sequence like this, and the position ends up slightly better for the black pieces. After these exchanges, black will win back the final pawn that he gave up, and black will be slightly more active, and this is going to be slightly better for him. Let me show you another pattern or another example. In this position, should black capture this pawn on b2? And the answer is not really, because if black captures this pawn on b2, we go a3, and the black queen is simply stuck here. It cannot go back. And after a move like rook takes e3, this is something you have to play, otherwise the queen gets trapped. For example, let's say you play c5, the bishop goes back to b3, and then rook goes to a2, and then bishop to d2 traps the queen finally. So you cannot exactly play a random move. You sort of have to sacrifice this rook for the bishop, because you have to create a square for yourself on b6 to get away, and that is exactly what black does. However, this position is still winning for the white pieces because of this tactical shot, knight to g5, attacking the pawn on f7. The knight is accepted, let's say. Rook takes f7 creates an absolutely devastating attack. Let me show you another example. So I brought lots of examples today, lots of positions that you guys can look at and analyze. Let me actually show you this specific example from the beginning, right out of the opening. So this is the example right here. It's this symmetrical c5 variation. This is not a great move for the black pieces, by the way, because it goes into this line right here. The knight cannot be taken because the queen is hanging, and this is the position that emerges right here. So in this position, black is threatening this knight on d4 and also threatening this pawn on b2. So a normal logical move here would be this move, knight to b3. However, we don't want to be passive. We can be active. Why should we defend the position when we can go in for the attack? Rook to c1, setting up some discoveries on this bishop. If the knight is taken after knight to b5, this position is completely lost because the queen once again has to move. And after either rook to c8 or knight c7, rook c8 is much better. Let me just make another move. Let's say queen d7, right? Protecting this bishop right here. Knight to c7 check simply picks up the rook in the corner with a winning position for white. And if instead of this knight right here, the pawn is taken, it's not really much better for the black pieces. Knight b5 anyways, and this attack is still coming. Nobody's gonna stop this, and the queen is also getting trapped in addition to the attack, because there's just simply no squares. The a3 square is covered, a2 square is covered, every square is covered. The queen is once again lost. We just talked about many situations when it is not okay to grab the poisoned pawn, but how do we determine when it is okay to take a poisoned pawn? And let me tell you when that's okay. So let's say in this position, white castles. Is it okay to take the pawn on b2 or no? The answer is yes, it is okay to take this pawn, and there are two things that you should look out for whenever grabbing the poisoned pawn. One of the things is whether the queen is getting trapped, and that's a more immediate threat. If the queen is getting trapped, of course, you don't want to take the pawn. If it's not getting trapped, then you have to look at the second detail, and that is whether the king has castled or not. It is important to castle the king because usually when you accept poison pawns, there is some counterplay and the center gets opened up very quickly, and usually the king is in trouble. However, if the king has already castled and the queen is not getting trapped, in those situations, you can most likely take the pawn and get away with it, and you will have a better position. Sometimes you're going to get into situations when you take a poisoned pawn, however, you're unable to get away, but the queen is not trapped either, so it's actually going to end in a forced draw. So after queen takes on b7, rook to b8, let's say the queen takes on a7, this position is actually a forced draw because after rook to a8, the queen has to go to b7, only square, knight b6, blocking the queen's way. Once again, this pattern emerges. And here, after a move like knight to f3, there is this move bishop back to c8. And here, if the queen goes to c6, which is the only square it can go to not be taken, there's bishop to d7, queen b7, bishop c8, and this leads to a draw. If you ever get into a situation when the rook can take the poisoned pawn and not the queen, you might want to hold off and you might want to be careful if there is a bishop around. So in a position like this, if white captures the pawn on b7, what happens is that this bishop on g7 will give a check on d4, the king has to move, and then the bishop will go back to b6. Now the rook is trapped on b7, and on the next move, king to c6 will be played, and this rook will simply be picked up. So if you play a move like, let's say, a4, a5 to try to get this rook out, king c6, this rook is lost, and it will probably have to sacrifice itself for the bishop, and now this pawn will be picked up, and rook versus knight is going to be a winning endgame for the black pieces in this position. In this whole video, we have been talking about the B poisoned pawn. Now let's briefly talk about the G poisoned pawn. So let me just show you an opening. This is called the Winauer French. I'm not going to go through all the details here. This is just one of the theoretical variations. And in a position like this, as you can see, this pawn on G7 is hanging. And this is the line where you actually capture this pawn on G7 and get into a position like this. So the poisoned pawn variation can arise on the king side as well. If the queen captures on G7, you take this pawn, rook goes to G8, and the patterns are quite similar. However, it is more difficult to generate play on the king side rather than the queen side most of the time, because the queen does not have access to this side of the board, but it has access over here. So usually the queen can help out. However, if the pawn is taken on the king side, this is harder for the black pieces to deal with. So in my personal opinion, the G pawn is not as poisoned as the B pawn. Usually taking the B pawn is more dangerous. However, the G pawn could be poisoned as well, and there is some compensation here for the black pieces in the form of some activity down the G file, and also some activity with this knight, with the queen. They're about to come alive in a couple of moves, and also these pieces will come alive also. Knight to d7 here, and some other moves will arise. We cannot talk about poisoned pawns and not mention the poisoned pawn variation in the Sicilian Najdorf. This is perhaps the most famous example of a poisoned pawn line, and in this case, white plays queen to d2, giving up this pawn. This is the most played move. Typically, white doesn't try to keep this pawn. There are some lines where like knight to b3 can be played, and this is another line that can be played. However, the most played move is to actually give up the pawn on b2 and get a lot of compensation for it with rook to b1, and then ideas like e5, knight has to go back here, and this is a very difficult position to play with the black pieces, and the win percentages reflect that. I'm going to put up the screenshot on the screen right now. It is very difficult to play this position, despite the fact that black is up a pawn, and despite the fact that the position is technically equal. This is very, very difficult for the black pieces, and the win percentages reflect that beautifully. So this is what I wanted to talk about today. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.